One post. 2 words. That's all it took to turn a Saturday night basketball game into the biggest controversy the WNBA has seen all year. And by the time you finish watching this, you're going to understand exactly why the league's own silence might be a bigger story than the foul that started it. Because what you're about to hear isn't just about a hard hit to the head on a fast break layup. It's about a $1,000 fine that nobody saw coming, a coach who refused to back down 2 days after watching the tape, a superstar who stood at a podium and said the one thing nobody expected her to say, and a commissioner's office that went quiet at the exact moment everyone needed it to speak. Stick with me, because the deeper you go into this timeline, the messier it gets, and the ending is not what you think. Let's set the scene properly, because context is everything here. August 8th, 2026, United Center, Chicago. The Indiana Fever are on the road against the Chicago Sky in a game that was already circled on every broadcaster's calendar. This isn't hyperbole. The Fever have been the most watched team in the entire league all season, and that means every road trip they take turns into a made-for-television event. Packed arenas, national cameras, millions of eyes, and that kind of attention changes the atmosphere on the floor. Players know this. Coaches know this. Every possession gets replayed and dissected online before the final horn even sounds, and that pressure was already baked into the game from tip-off. First quarter. The pace is frantic, physical, the way it always is when two teams know the whole country is watching in real time. Sophie Cunningham gets loose in transition. She's got daylight, a clean step on the defense, the kind of fast break layup that 99 times out of 100 ends with a routine 2 points and nothing more to say about it. This was the 100th time. DiJonai Carrington comes flying in from behind and catches Cunningham high, across the head and neck, hard enough that Cunningham's whole body twists sideways in the air. Somehow the shot still falls through the net, but the landing is violent, and for one long second the entire arena goes dead silent. That specific kind of silence a crowd gives right before it decides how loud it's about to get. The officials don't just wave it off. They stop the game cold and head to the monitor, because what they saw live already looked like something more than a standard hard foul. They go frame by frame through every camera angle available, and when they come back out, the ruling is upgraded to a flagrant foul too. The officiating crew's own breakdown of the play used 3 words that matter a lot here: wind up, impact, and follow through high across the neck. That's not one isolated moment of incidental contact. That's a full sequence, a complete motion that fits exactly what the rulebook defines as excessive and unnecessary contact. This wasn't some 50-50 judgment call that could have gone either way depending on which crew was working that night. The tape backed it up clean. A flagrant 2 means an automatic ejection, and Carrington is sent off the floor immediately. But the story doesn't end with her walking to the locker room. Cunningham pops right back up, and the anger on her face is visible from the cheap seats. She closes the distance on Carrington. There's a shove, and both benches empty just enough that officials have to physically get between the two of them before this turns into something even bigger than a flagrant and an ejection. Indiana holds on and wins the game 90-86. In literally any other week in league history, that's the whole story. Road win, tough environment, another chapter in a Fever season that's already rewriting the WNBA's television numbers. But this was not a normal week, and the moment that final buzzer sounded, the score stopped being the headline entirely. Now here's a piece of context that a huge chunk of the early coverage completely buried, and once you hear it, you'll understand why the officiating crew made the call they made without hesitation. This was not Carrington's first flagrant foul of the season. It wasn't even her second. Earlier in the year, she picked up a flagrant for a hit to the head against Minnesota's Jessica Shepard on opening night. Then later in the season, another one, this time against Seattle's Skylar Diggins-Smith, again involving high contact around the head. 2 separate flagrant fouls, 2 separate opponents, 2 separate games, all before August even rolled around. Analysts who follow this league closely were already quietly discussing the pattern before this incident ever happened. So think about the position the review crew was actually standing in when they walked over to that monitor. They weren't grading one random play in a vacuum. They were grading it with a full season of receipts sitting right behind it. A player who had already been flagged twice in the same category of high-risk, high-contact plays, now committing a third one, on national television, against an opponent who everybody in the league already knew was not the type to let a hard foul slide quietly. For the review team, that's about as close to an easy call as this sport produces. And yet in that first wave of reaction online, almost none of that history got mentioned. The narrative that formed in those first few minutes formed fast, it formed loud, and it left out the part where this was strike 3 in the same calendar year. That gap in the coverage is exactly what let the entire conversation skip right past the basketball and land directly on 2 words posted to social media minutes after the ejection. Which brings us to Cunningham, because her response afterward is honestly the most underrated part of this entire saga. If the league or anyone in that press room expected her to give the usual post-game nothing answer, the safe non-committal quote that gets forgotten by morning, she did not play along. Asked point blank whether she thought the foul was intentional, she didn't hesitate for a second. She said flatly that it felt unnecessary, that she had no prior issue with Carrington going into that game, and that she was never going to just absorb a hit like that without reacting. Her exact words were that she popped up because she wasn't going to let anyone do that to her, and that everybody already knows that about her. Then she said something that a lot of the initial coverage treated as a throwaway line, but it's actually the single most important quote in this entire story. When a reporter brought up the white privilege post that was already circulating while she was still getting dressed in the locker room, Cunningham didn't dodge the question even a little. She said this has nothing to do with race, that last year she did the exact same thing, got ejected for it, and openly admitted she deserved to be sent off. And then she added that there was no reason to play that card here. That callback to her own history wasn't something she dug up to win an argument in the moment. It was a real, documented receipt. Cunningham herself was ejected in 2025 for a flagrant foul in a physical game, part of the exact same on-court reputation she's built in Indiana as someone who plays right up against the edge of the rulebook and never apologizes for it afterward. By bringing that up completely unprompted, she wasn't just rejecting the racial framing in the abstract. She was pointing straight at her own case file and daring anyone in that room to explain why the standard should suddenly be different this time around. What people kept coming back to afterward wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. No deflecting to a team statement. No stalling for a PR person to step in. No safe, coached, forgettable non-answer. She handled the basketball question and the far more explosive cultural question back to back, in the same breath, without missing a beat. In a league where post-game media availability usually turns into a parade of polished nothing, that kind of directness stood out immediately, and it stood out even harder because of exactly what she was responding to. Because here's what actually happened minutes after Carrington walked off that court. She picked up her phone and posted 2 words on social media, tagged directly at the Indiana Fever organization. White privilege. No sentence attached. No explanation of what she meant, what specifically she was pointing at, nothing. Just 2 words fired straight into a sports internet that was already replaying her foul on a loop from 6 different angles. The reaction was instant, and it split almost perfectly down predictable lines. On one side, people pointed to Carrington's academic background. She studied African and African American studies at Stanford, and her defenders argued she was reaching for something much bigger than one basketball play, a broader point about how physical contact gets judged differently depending on who's delivering it and who's on the receiving end, and that the real target of her post wasn't the ejection itself, but the larger pattern behind decisions like it. On the other side, the pushback was blunt and immediate. You cannot take a clean officiating decision, one that was reviewed frame by frame from every angle and upgraded on its own clear merits, by a crew with zero motivation to favor either player, and turn it into a racial flashpoint within minutes of hitting someone in the head and neck. Whatever the deeper academic point behind that phrase might have been, slapping it onto this specific play, on this specific night, with zero explanation, was always going to be read by almost everyone scrolling past it as a direct accusation. Intent doesn't control how something lands online. Reception does. Even the coaches couldn't agree, which tells you everything about how split this became. Fever head coach Stephanie White said she believed the officiating call was correct while also not believing Carrington meant to actually injure Cunningham. A careful answer that basically satisfies nobody looking for a clean villain in this story, which is probably exactly why she chose to phrase it that way. Sky head coach Tyler Marsh saw it completely differently. In the moment, without having seen the replay yet, he said he thought Carrington was simply making a play on the ball. 2 days later, after the footage had been broken down from every conceivable angle, his position hadn't really moved. He kept defending his player's intent and pushed back on what he called inconsistent officiating around the league. He also acknowledged, carefully, that there was a significant amount of vitriol being directed at Carrington personally, and that if the league is serious about protecting its players, that protection needs to extend to everyone, not just to whichever side of a controversy happens to be more popular in the moment. By Sunday morning, this had already jumped completely out of the sports section. Columnists who hadn't written one single word about the WNBA all season were suddenly filing hot takes. Cable panels were dissecting a 2-word social media post with the same intensity they'd normally reserve for a Senate hearing. And the one organization actually responsible for setting the standard here, the league itself, had said almost nothing at all. So what did the WNBA actually do about any of this? Carrington was fined $1,000 in connection with the ejection and the post. That's it. That's the entire public response from the league to a controversy that had been dominating national sports media and spilling into general news coverage for 2 straight days. No suspension, no follow-up statement addressing the post directly, no public clarification of where the league actually draws the line when a player responds to a reviewed and upheld officiating decision with racially charged language aimed at the opposing organization. And the clearest signal of just how far that silence stretched came on Monday night, when Carrington suited up and played completely normally against the Seattle Storm, checking into the game just past the 5-minute mark of the first quarter like the previous 48 hours simply hadn't happened. Now here's the comparison that has people around this league the most uncomfortable, and once you hear it laid out side by side, you'll understand why. Just weeks before this game, a co-owner of the Seattle Storm was suspended by the league and fined after confronting 2 teenage fans in a parking lot who were holding up a sign in support of Cunningham's publicly stated views on transgender athletes in sports. That suspension came fast. The league acted, issued a statement, and it was widely covered as proof the WNBA was finally serious about holding people accountable for conduct. Now line that up against what just happened here. One incident involves a team executive saying something to a pair of teenagers outside an arena. The other involves a nationally televised flagrant foul upgraded on review, an ejection, a racially charged social media post that spent 2 full days as the single dominant story in American sports media, and a player back on the floor 48 hours later with nothing more than a fine so quiet most fans didn't even know it existed until reporters went digging for it. That is not a subtle inconsistency. That is a gap wide enough to drive a truck through, and the timing made it even worse, because Commissioner Kathy Engelbert had already sent a memo to every team just days earlier acknowledging that internal discussions about transgender athlete participation were still ongoing across the league. In other words, the WNBA was already trying to manage one extremely sensitive live wire, and then this landed directly on top of it, and the response was to go quiet. That is not exactly a crisis communication strategy that inspires a lot of confidence. 2 days after the original post, Carrington tried to walk part of it back. She published a longer explanation online, writing that she never claimed the officiating decision itself was an act of white privilege, and pushing back on what she called a misreading of her original message. She referenced her academic background again as justification for using that language in the first place. Whether that clarification landed the way she intended is a completely separate debate. But here's the part that isn't up for debate at all. It arrived 2 full days after the original story had already formed, hardened, and spread to every corner of sports media without it. The correction showed up long after the narrative had already been written in its absence, and that gap between what somebody says they meant and what nearly everyone reading 2 words with 0 context actually took away from it is exactly why this story had the shelf life it did. Intent and reception are 2 completely different things, and no follow-up post, however well-reasoned, fully closes that distance once the damage is already done. With the league staying silent, the pressure didn't just disappear. It moved to people with bigger platforms and a lot less patience for careful non-answers. Fox News columnist Joe Concha called for a full season-long suspension, framing the foul itself as deliberate and politically motivated, and tying the entire incident directly to the ongoing backlash Cunningham has faced over her comments on transgender athletes. Analyst Aaron Torres went even further, publicly suggesting it might be time for NBA Commissioner Adam Silver to step in personally. Emmanuel Aiko added his voice too, calling out the post directly and telling Carrington plainly that she cannot frame that specific foul as an example of white privilege. Now here's what needs to be said clearly, because a lot of the loudest commentary blurred this line. None of those public calls for Silver to intervene mean that Silver has actually done anything here. He hasn't commented on the Cunningham-Carrington incident at all. His most recent public remarks about the WNBA this year were focused on league finances, where he's previously acknowledged that the NBA has absorbed real annual losses to keep the women's league financially operational, plus a very carefully neutral answer earlier this season about whether Commissioner Engelbert will remain in her role beyond this year, where his exact position was that he hadn't yet had that conversation with her about her future, even while praising the job she's done. That distinction matters enormously, because it explains exactly why so many people keep looking upward toward the NBA whenever something like this happens. The NBA isn't some distant cousin organization loosely connected to the WNBA. It is the financial backbone underneath it. By some public estimates tied to the league's revenue structure, roughly 40% of WNBA revenue flows through the NBA. Another fifth belongs to outside investors who came in through a capital raise a few years back. Whatever remains after that gets split between the teams and the players themselves. Silver has publicly acknowledged that the NBA has absorbed real financial losses year over year just to keep the WNBA running. So when an organization is that deeply financially entangled with another one, and a controversy this loud plays out while the smaller league's front office says almost nothing, it's not exactly a stretch for people to start asking whether the organization with the deeper pockets and the bigger microphone should be the one to finally break that silence, especially when the smaller league's growth is the entire justification for that investment continuing in the first place. And the growth here has been very real. Franchise valuations, viewership numbers, social media engagement, all of it has climbed sharply across the WNBA over the past 2 seasons. Nearly every Fever Road game is close to a sellout now. National broadcast numbers are up across the board. A massive share of the people watching right now are brand new to this sport entirely, pulled in specifically by Caitlin Clark, by Cunningham, by exactly this kind of high-stakes, high-emotion basketball that turns casual viewers into invested fans practically overnight. But a bigger audience automatically means a bigger spotlight on how the league handles moments exactly like this one. And right now that spotlight is landing squarely on a 4-figure fine and nearly 2 weeks of institutional silence. Here's the simplest possible way to explain why this entire situation matters as much as it does. Every single day the WNBA doesn't clarify its own standard for the foul, for the post, for what accountability actually looks like in a moment like this, is another day where columnists, analysts, fans, and critics get to fill that silence with their own competing version of events. Some of those versions are completely fair. Some of them are clearly reaching for a narrative that isn't fully there. But the league doesn't get to control which version sticks in the public memory if it isn't willing to say anything itself. That's the real risk buried underneath all of this. And it's not about any single fine or hypothetical suspension. It's not really even about whether Carrington sits 1 extra game or none at all. The actual risk is what happens when an institution goes quiet long enough that the entire story ends up getting told completely without its input, and then has to live permanently with whatever version of itself that silence allowed other people to create. Cunningham handled her end of this with more composure than anyone had any right to expect from a 20-something professional athlete standing in front of a wall of cameras minutes after getting hit in the head. She brought up her own history completely unprompted, drew a direct line from her own 2025 ejection straight to this one, and essentially dared anyone listening to explain the difference. She answered the basketball question and the far more loaded cultural question in the exact same breath, and walked away from that podium having fully controlled the one part of this entire story that was actually hers to control. Carrington's clarification, whatever legitimate academic point sits underneath it, arrived 2 days too late to change how this played out. Not because the underlying argument has no basis at all, but because 2 words with zero context, tagged directly at the opposing organization minutes after hitting one of their players in the head and neck were always going to be read by almost everyone scrolling past them as a direct accusation. That gap between what someone intended and what an audience actually receives is not something a follow-up post can fully close once the initial version of the story has already traveled as far as this one did. The leagues find satisfied essentially nobody. Not the people who believe the conduct here warranted an actual suspension. Not the people who suspected the fine itself was a quiet way of penalizing the post without ever officially saying so out loud. Not the reporters who had to explain all of this to their audiences with almost no real statement to work from. And definitely not the fans who watched Carrington check back into a normal game 2 days later as though none of the previous 48 hours had ever happened at all. And now the real question hanging over this entire league is whether the people actually running it have the stomach to do what a moment this size actually requires. The WNBA is bigger right now than it has ever been in its history. Its audience is newer, wider, and more emotionally invested than it has ever been. And the standard this league sets right now for how it handles race, intent, and accountability in a moment exactly like this one is going to be the thing that brand new audience remembers long after the score of this particular game is forgotten. Wind up, impact, follow through. That's the exact standard the league used to make the call on the court that night. The real question left hanging in the air is whether that same standard ever gets applied off the court too, and whether the follow-through that still hasn't arrived ever actually comes, because silence has a shelf life of its own, and eventually, whether the league likes it or not, silence becomes its own answer.